Let's begin. For the next 90 minutes, we'll have some different topics we'll be talking about over through the overall theme of promoting a culture of respect and consent. So as you see, we're going to start by introducing our panelists and then get into the four themes, which are how do we define respect and consent? Where do we learn about respect and consent? Promoting a culture of respect and consent, and engaging with the community. Following that discussion, we'll have some time for resource sharing and questions for the panelists. A couple of reminders as we begin. Please take care of yourselves during this webinar. PowerPoint slides and certificates of attendance will be available at the end, and a recording of this webinar will be emailed along with other resources. I want to start by introducing our panelists and let them talk a little bit about why they wanted to be a part of this conversation. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelist, Khalees. Khalees, if you'd like to unmute and talk a little bit about yourself and why you wanted to be part of this conversation.
Sure. Hi, my name is Khalees Smith. Excuse me, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I work for SOS, Sexual Violence Services. I'm a sexual violence counselor, and I'm the outreach service coordinator, which I love because not only do I get to work directly with survivors of sexual violence and their family and friends, provide services for them, but on the other side, I also get to train law enforcement, prosecutors, forensic nurses, anybody that works with sexual assault victims. I get to train them on how traumatic sexual violence is. And especially for law enforcement, it's not interrogation, it's an interview, it's a conversation with somebody. So it's totally different for them, and also for prosecutors. They are interested in collecting the evidence and bringing this to court and getting charges. And it's still about this person has been traumatized. So how can I ask them questions that I won't be re-traumatizing them? So that's a huge part of my job. Like I said, I love it. I love being able to tell law enforcement and prosecutors what survivors are saying about our services so that we can improve them. I think that's very important. We have to make these decisions with input from sexual assault survivors who are actually experiencing this and going through the system and hitting all these roadblocks and stumbling blocks. And it's just an honor and a privilege for me to be able to be here and share some of my knowledge and experience with you all, but also to work with survivors and to understand that what they are experiencing is normal for somebody that has been sexually assaulted. And as a society, we don't understand that. And my job is to get that word out to everybody and anybody I can about what sexual violence is and how to help survivors and support them and not judge them. So I'm just here to, like I said, share my experiences, but also learn from all of you. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Khalees. And I'm going to turn it over to Hunter, who is our second panelist now. Oh, I went backwards. My bad. There we go.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, my name is Hunter Beckstrom. I use he, him, and his pronouns, and I am the Prevention Program Coordinator at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And so our organization is a statewide coalition, and we really identify ourselves as technical assistance providers. So what I say typically is that we work with direct service providers who work with victims and survivors to ensure that they are being the best service providers they can be. Because certainly those folks are more in the know of what their community's specific needs are. We just try to help them get all the resources, all the expertise that they might need. And why I'm so interested, not only in my role at MNCASA, but also doing this presentation is that, of course, I specialize in preventing sexual violence, but I think it's very important to be aware of the fact that really preventing all types of harm, whether that's domestic violence or experiencing different types of societal forms of oppression, is still also very much a part of these conversations as well. And so not only do we have to work, what I say, in two ways, not only do we have to stop the violence from happening, so really trying to focus on that primary prevention before harm ever happens. So we have to work towards that, but also the second piece is that not only do we want to live in environments and communities that are free from violence, but we also want to live in happy, thriving, and healthy environments too, right? And so that really speaks to this whole topic of creating a culture that has consent and respect. So I'm really just excited to be a part of this conversation with you all today. As Khalees was saying, learning a little bit from you all as well, since y'all are experts as well, and just kind of being able to continue some of this work moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. At this moment, we are going to learn a bit about the folks who are viewing this webinar today via a word cloud. So on the following slide, here are some instructions. We're going to be using a website called Menti to create a word cloud. So you can scan the QR code that's on the screen. Otherwise, I'm going to drop a link in the chat right now. And you can access this on your phone or on a computer with internet access. And you can type in any of these identities on the right side that you feel are especially pertinent or you want to share with the folks who are here today. For example, social identities such as racial, ethnic identity, or gender identity, your profession. So if you're an advocate, a teacher, a mental health provider, or a completely different profession, maybe your familial role, your community role, and anything else that makes you uniquely you. So like I said, you can scan the QR code or use the link that I just dropped in the chat. Oh, I did not share that to everyone. The link that I just dropped in the chat, you should be able to see it. It'll take you to a website called Menti. And I'm going to pull that up on my end so we can all look at the word cloud together. So in just a moment, I will have the word cloud open and we can look at all that. We can look at what folks are saying. So let's go to Menti and see what folks are saying. So on the screen, you should see there are some words. The more times a word is said, the bigger it gets. So we can see the word social worker. Multiple people here are social workers, maybe you're advocates. I'll give folks a little bit more time to type in here. You can type in multiple words as well, which I think is great. Kind of get an idea of the folks who are here and how we can learn from each other. You can also go to the website www.menti.com and just type in the code that's at the top of the screen if you do not want to click on the link or scan the QR code. Okay, I will give folks another minute here to type in. And as you can see, the word cloud is kind of getting larger and larger with all of the submissions, which is great. Some commonalities is we have a lot of advocates, a lot of people who see their identities as woman, female, friend, sister, very salient, social worker, kitty mama is one. Just things that make you uniquely you and you want to share with us here. Great. So thank you all for participating in the word cloud. I'm going to go back to our slides now. But I think that it's a great opportunity to learn, to know all the folks who are here and how we can learn from each other and what makes us uniquely ourselves and why we want to get involved in this conversation. Some folks in the chat also said advocate, free spirit, resource navigator, case manager, familial roles such as mother, aunt, and grandparent. That's great to hear. So we're going to go ahead and start with the first theme here, which is defining respect and consent. So this is going to be what we do in the chat. So folks want to open the Zoom chat, make sure it's set to send to everyone, and talk about what words they associate with the word consent. Feel free to continue to submit in the chat. I'm seeing a lot of commonalities. We have some people saying permission, boundaries, no coercion, enthusiastic, freely given, understanding, acceptance, agreement. These are all great. Feel free to continue to submit in the chat. Great. Thank you everyone for kind of sounding out in the chat. It's great to hear that we have some commonalities, but also we have a lot of great definitions here of consent. This slide here has an infographic. It has some of the words we saw in the chat when talking about consent. These infographics are often used in discussion of consent. On the left side, we see what is considered consent. Someone said freely given in the chat, enthusiastic, essential is one that I saw, boundaries is one that I saw, respecting boundaries is part of consent. And then on the right side here, we have some things that do not indicate consent, saying yes or saying nothing while under the influence of drugs or alcohol, saying yes because you're giving into pressure, and then some things like flirting or silence do not necessarily indicate consent. So this is a great way to think about what aspects indicate consent and what aspects don't, and what makes up something that's fully consensual. Here we have another infographic. This one's provided by Planned Parenthood, and it kind of has 5 main terms that help you indicate what consent is. Some of these terms were also in the previous slide, also in the chat. I'm just going to read them off. They say freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific. I'm pretty sure I saw all of these in the chat. This is a very popular infographic and one that helps us understand what aspects make up consent. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. We have a couple of questions here for them to answer. So panelists, feel free to answer whichever ones speak most to you. Yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. I can go. So you said we can pick a question. Is that what you said? I'm sorry.
Yeah, for sure. Pick any question that you'd like to answer that speaks to you.
Okay. I think for me, as far as describing consent, I loved all the words that people gave, but there were words that I didn't even think of to describe consent. But I like the word agreement, like an agreement between two people. And I like the word reversible, right? Because sometimes stuff is okay with us, maybe that day, but then maybe the next day it's not. Like, for instance, I know that I have a friend, and sometimes she doesn't like her personal space invaded, and then other times she's trying to hug you, so you never know what you're going to get. And so I kind of asked her, is it okay to hug you today? She's like, yeah, that's great. She goes, well, no, really not today. I'm not in the mood. So I like that term, that it can be taken back. Because like I said, we do change our mind. I think also consent is about, and I got this from one of my survivors. Her daughter was sexually assaulted, and she's like 13 or 14. And mom wanted the school counselor to know in case the daughter had problems during school. And instead of the mom just calling the counselor, she sat down and talked to her kid and said, hey, I think it's a good idea if we let the counselor know kind of what's going on, but how do you feel about it? If you don't want to do it, we don't have to do that. And I thought that was great to actually have that conversation and let the daughter consent to, I want the counselor to know, because the daughter was sexually assaulted, not mom. And I love that she gave her that choice, but not only that, but she had enough respect for her, because a lot of times as parents, we just make decisions for our kids that we think are best for them, instead of actually, well, let me ask them how they feel about this. Let's have a conversation. And I think that's great. So to me, it's about being a good listener. respecting somebody's boundaries, and not judging them for the way they feel, and not trying to change the way they feel or those certain things that they feel very strongly about. Just accept it and respect it, because everybody's different, and we're all individuals. And I think that's just important, to not take things and people for granted, especially maybe because they're younger. Maybe we think they don't have an opinion or they don't know what's right for them, but just simply having them conversations. And we know in this day and age that we need to have a lot of conversations a lot earlier with our family members and our children, and everybody that is around us, so that we can all kind of be on the same page, because there's a lot going on in the world that is not always good. And having those conversations and letting individuals know that, no, you do have a choice, and I respect your choices. So thank you.
Well, I would absolutely second everything else that Khalees had said as well, and I will try to jump into some other pieces here. But I think what I really enjoyed about what folks had thrown in the comments section was that nothing was very specific to solely sexual activity, for example, right? And so really being aware of, whenever I have done trainings about consent, I first put it within the context that consent is related to everything, right? So no matter what, if I have been doing this educational training for young kids or just community members and adults, I think it's really important to preface that consent is involved with asking your classmate for a writing utensil, or asking a friend to hang out, or asking your coworker to take your shift next week, something like that. All of that is grounded within consent, right? And I think just trying to being aware of some of the other aspects with consent and Planned Parenthood's acronym of FRIES, I think that is super helpful, because I've always utilized that when I've done consent trainings, and it's very digestible, because just think, for example, again, I'm from Minnesota, so I'm going to use, for example, a Minnesota state statute might have a paragraph long definition of what consent is, and that can be very difficult and inaccessible for folks. So just utilizing even if it's just 5 main themes of what consent can look like, it's much more easily digestible and accessible, especially for younger folks as well. And then kind of pointing to this idea of words, actions, and enthusiastic consent, really being aware of the importance that someone's body language and their verbal response should match. I think that is very important, especially when we're trying to educate young folks around consent. So even if someone is saying verbally yes, but their body language is extremely closed off, or they seem very uncomfortable in this situation, that you should really be able to pick that up on their body language, to be aware that they're probably not truly comfortable, even though that they said yes to whatever that agreement might be. And answering some of these other pieces here on the slide, we can see, I think it's really important to be aware of the fact that some of the other areas that consent might be modeled, but we might not initially think of it, is kind of within the service, many different types of service industries. So for example, a few months ago, I went to my very first chiropractor appointment. And so I had never had any experience doing that, but the person doing that service was walking me through step by step about everything that was going to happen, and asked, like, can I put my hand on your back in this way, or whatever that might be. And I think that's important, because we might initially just assume, well, that's a part of the service or a part of what's going on, but it really builds that rapport and that trust, just making sure to check in with that person. And then finally, one thing that I can also point to is question 3, kind of talking about the concept of boundaries and people pleasing. And I want to just be aware of how this is so closely related to gender, and really being aware of the facts, when it comes to, what it means being a quote unquote man or woman in our society. Young girls are taught from a certain age that they should be compliant and caring and service oriented, whereas young boys are really taught to be socialized to be dominant and forceful and decision makers. And so I really think it's important to be able to be aware of this gendered socialization, because then that shows who potentially has power, control, and privilege within these types of interactions with folks. And certainly people who have that power and privilege more often will actually, take down people's barriers, and the people who are not as comfortable putting those up are typically the folks who are being more people pleasing. Oftentimes we see that in younger girls, for example. So really just being aware of how this is very closely related to gender as well.
Yeah, excuse me. Oh, I totally agree, Hunter. I was just thinking of some things. I live with my mom, who's 92 years old, and she talks to me about stuff that happened in the 50s and 60s. And I'm like, well, why would you take that? Why wouldn't you, because with her first husband, there was abuse. And I thought, yeah, I would never stand for that. She said there was nowhere to go. There was not rape crisis agencies or domestic violence places. And she said back then it was like your husbands own you, right? You were property of them and you had to do what they wanted, whether you wanted to or not. You really didn't have a voice. You weren't respected. You were there to take care of the house and the kids. And she said now when I talk about things and tell her things, she said she can see so how far we have come, but also how far we have to go, right? Because we're not, like you talked about gender and all that kind of stuff, we're just not accepting of everyone, and everyone is kind of looked at different, whether that's gender identity, whether that's your race. And we know that people are treated different according to how they identify or their race and those kind of things. She said, but I have seen a lot of progress in other areas as far as having programs and services to help people get out of violent situations. So things are gradually changing. I think the Me Too movement has done a lot for domestic violence victims, of course, and mainly sexual assault victims, but to be able to give them a voice and come forward and say, no, this is not okay. And I always say in my trainings that we, as individuals, we don't have control over a lot in our lives, but we should have control over who, when, and where someone does something to us that we don't consent to. And when that's taken away, that's huge. And years ago, that was always taken away. My mom said, I never had a voice. I never had a voice. And so, like I said, I think we have learned a lot. And I think we're growing as a society. We have a lot more growing to do as far as being open. I think it's so cool when you meet people that are not like you, because you learn from them. You learn about different cultures, and I have met somebody from Sudan and somebody from another part of the country, and they've taught me so much about different things. And this is why the U.S. is so great, and this is what we need to take advantage of, is all the diversity that is here, instead of putting down some groups of people, because that's not helpful. So we come a long ways, but we have a long ways to go. But I think we're kind of on the right track. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
Thank you so much. I want to take a moment and let our participants drop anything in the chat or Q&A section. If they have any other questions, if their understanding has changed, or if now looking back, if they have any other words they would want to use to describe consent. So I'm going to give participants a second here if they'd like to add anything to the chat or the Q&A section.
I have a quick question actually for the panelists. This is Brenison. It's kind of related to question 3. And it made me think of how there's so many folks that I have worked with, victim survivors, who are in their 30s, 40s, even 50s, where they're realizing for the first time that they have agency over their own bodies. And I'm just curious of how we can kind of shift the culture too about, I don't know, I think that's why boundaries comes up a lot, where people don't even realize that they can set boundaries, that they're allowed to, that they have to kind of give themselves permission to be able to do that too. So I'm curious of what your ideas are for what are ways that we can teach children at basic levels, or what are ways that people can find out that they do have agency over their own bodies, and that they can speak up for themselves, and that their voice does matter and what happens to them in terms of bodily autonomy before something happens or before they are well into adulthood.
Yeah, I think I think that's why that reminds me of like child abuse cases. We leave our kids with family members and good friends, individuals we trust that we think will take good care of them like we do. Unfortunately, those are the ones that are hurting them. So I think we have to start at a very early age, teaching kids about their body parts. The other thing is we can't be scared to say things like kids. We have to treat them like other body parts, like our arm and our leg. That's why kids don't disclose. They're even scared to say the words to their parents. So saying the words, trying to normalize those parts of the body and teaching them, you know, about good touch, bad touch, teaching them if you don't want to get hugged by somebody, you don't have to. Let mom, let dad know. Just having those conversations, but I think starting early. And, you know, I grew up in the 70s, in the 80s, and my parents never had those conversations with me, right? It was like grandma would come over, give grandma a hug. When I was little, grandma was kind of scary. I didn't want to hug grandma, but did I dare say no? No, I wouldn't have hugged grandma. But giving kids that option, even if it is family, sometimes they're not comfortable with that. And that's okay. It doesn't mean they're a bad kid or they're spoiled or, you know, standoffish. That's not it, but just, I think it's very important to give kids that choice. But we have to have those conversations early, and we can't say stuff like, oh, well, boys will be boys, and, you know, that's okay, and excusing behaviors and all that stuff. No, that's in the past. That's what we did in the past, and that did not work. We have to do things different. But I also believe that a lot of it has to happen in the home. Parents, whether they know it or not, they have a huge influence on their kids. Even if they think their kids aren't listening, paying attention, they're taking it all in. And they may not do what you say all the time, but they are taking it in and they're listening. And that stuff needs to start at home. We can't expect the schools to do everything, to teach our kids everything, to raise our kids and after school programs and that kind of thing. We all have to work together. But I think it's very, very important for it to start at home. I think parents have to parent a different way. Like I raised my kids totally different than the way my mom raised me. And I'm sure my daughter is raising hers different because she's learned and things have changed. And that's what needs to happen. I mean, I talk to my kids at 12 and 13 about sex. She's talking to hers now at 7 and 8, you know, because things are different and if, you know, things start happening. So I think it's all in a matter of having those conversations, but having them early and being open and not being scared to say those words about our body parts, because that's important. And that's even hard for adults to say those words. I've been in a lot of police interviews and they'll say everything. And then the police will say, you mean your vagina? Like, you know, yeah, you know. So it's funny because there's sex all over social media. It's all on TV, all these kind of words and stuff. But when it comes to us having conversations, we're a little, you know, we hold back a little bit. And that should not be it. We should be honest, and we should be having those honest conversations with each other, with family members, with children, with our peers, with everyone.
And just a couple of real quick things I can throw in as well. I really think we are not aware of the feelings of obligation and even power dynamics within our close familial relationships and intimate relationships, especially when Khalees was talking about our grandparents, right? So there can be a lot of very strong norms with elders in our society. And so you can't say no to grandma or grandpa or things like that, right? And so that's a very huge norm within our society as well. And so I think if you are a parent or guardian who is trying to have conversations early with your own children, really trying to have those conversations in extension with your other, distant relatives or whatever, to hopefully not have those family members potentially take offense if their grandchild would say no to a hug or something, right? And I think that's also why it's so important to have these boundaries in place, because oftentimes in our society, since we're not normalized to people setting boundaries, they take automatic offense to when people actually set up boundaries. And so I think all of this is, again, very intersected. And like Khalees was saying, really having these conversations very early on. And again, how we were talking about consent, it doesn't have to be related to sexual activity right off the bat, just really being aware of folks' bodily autonomy, even saying our body parts accurately, right? As you were saying as well, Khalees, just really being grounded in some of these conversations early, and then trying to bring this out within your other relationships as well.
Thank you both so much, and thank you to folks who were posting in the chat during the discussion, talking about, consent is so much more than what we think about when we think about just intimate relationships. It's so much more than yes or no. We do have a question in the chat, kind of related to like talking about consent. And the question is, how do we get parents to talk with their kids? Where do we get the message out? How do we get it out? This individual said, I'm incentivized to seek out this information, but most people aren't. If either of you want to talk a little bit more about how parents can talk to their children or their family about consent.
I suppose I can do an actual quick plug for a resource that the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault recently made. And we created a healthy relationships activity book, just because we know a lot of parents and guardians might be very interested in having these conversations, but might not have the knowledge to actually be able to facilitate these types of difficult and awkward conversations sometimes. So we actually created both a parent guardian guide and then also a youth activity book that's very engaging, offering a lot of different information, and again, quite intersectional as well. And I see that E had already thrown that in the chat. So I did just want to make that short plug and everything. So again, just this overall idea, really trying to make resources be tangible. So making sure that they're not too abstract and people can actually have very actionable lessons taken away, whether that's actual phrases or words that people can use to say no to some sort of circumstance, or how to help out a friend who has been in a difficult experience, different things like that. So don't want to spend too much time on that, but of course, if folks have any more questions they would like to talk about the activity book, please. I know that we have our contact information after this as well.
Thanks, Hunter. I didn't know about that resource, but I think that's a great one for parents, because I think those conversations are hard for parents. I think talking to kids about not only what unhealthy relationship looks like, but also a healthy relationship, because I think in a lot of homes, they may see one or the other, right? So they may see an unhealthy relationship and think that's the norm, right? And then they get in an unhealthy relationship. So I think explaining both of those, I think is important. And then what a healthy relationship looks like. And then just having them really think about what do you want out of this relationship, I think is important. But I did not have that resource, so I will definitely be directing parents to that. Right now, I'm kind of working with the high schools and working with juniors and seniors, and they are working on doing stuff for their whole class on consent, and kind of what that it's consent and respect and kind of what that looks like, because they're leaving high school and going to college. And so we're just kind of talking about all that. There's a lot, as you guys know, that is going on in the high schools that is not positive. A lot of sexual assault happens constantly all during the day for these students. And so I'm working more with the students, of course, with the counselors and social workers also on what we can do. And getting the input from the students on what they need to feel safe in school and to be respected and to not have their boundaries crossed and to be in healthy relationships and those kind of things. So thank you, Hunter. Like I said, that's a great resource. I know MNCASA, I used to be on the board years ago, and so I know you guys have a lot of great resources. I just had to familiarize myself with them again. But thanks for bringing that one up because that's great. I know parents want to have these conversations, but how do I start it out? And they're probably like, do I have enough knowledge on this subject to help my kids, right? Because we know that sometimes words can be harmful instead of helpful. So I will definitely be utilizing that.
Yeah, thank you both so much for resource sharing. We'll also have some more resources and time for extra questions at the end of the webinar and in the post-webinar email, and that resource will include a lot of stuff from MNCASA. At this time, I'm going to move to our next theme here, which our panelists have kind of already talked about, but we're going to be learning, we're going to be discussing and kind of unpacking where we learn about respecting consent and what it teaches us. So we're going to start by taking some time in the chat. Now that we all have a common understanding of consent, we can think of places in our life, society, or history where we see a lack of consent as accepted or maybe even glamorized. So feel free to drop examples in the chat. I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes to do so, and then I'll read some out. I'm going to begin to read out some responses, but please feel free to continue to add. Some folks have talked about specific institutions such as prisons or hospitals or schools, which is definitely examples that I immediately thought of. So thank you for bringing them to my attention, because the more you unpack that, the more you realize that. One person in the chat said, we need to stop teaching kids and saying sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can't hurt me. It's not true. Stop saying it and stop others when they say it. Definitely true. Some more examples people are dropping in the chat include social media, TV shows, movies, music, video games, social media. Some folks are talking about like social situations like at the club, bars, parties, music festivals, even at work. Most institutions or systems with people with disabilities or mental illnesses. These are all examples where we can kind of see that boundary crossing being normalized or even encouraged. So I'm going to give folks a couple more minutes here to drop some in the chat. So one individual in the chat also talked a bit about how it shows up in TV and movies. They continue to romanticize sexual situations that are coercive and forceful, and they say it's better than in the 80s and 90s, but not much. One person said, not sure if anyone mentioned prison systems yet, but consent there is an issue. One person elaborated a little bit about work. They said, even at work, when people ask a question and then say silence is consent, this is definitely an example of that. Thank you everyone for your input in the chat and talking about, but also elaborating and building upon other people's points as we go on. It's super awesome to see the amount of collaboration we have in the chat. I'm going to go on to the next slide now. And on this slide, we have an infographic from the account Mental Health CEO on Instagram. And this just has some more examples about boundary crossings and what things that know me know applies to apart from sex. So as folks have mentioned in the chat earlier, sometimes we think of consent, or the greater understanding of consent is that it's only in intimate relationships and it's only yes or no. But now we know that that is not necessarily true, and it can happen in many other situations and in many other forms. So this is just some examples. Some were mentioned in the chat, but talking about hugs, touch, physical affection, taking drugs or substances, any physical contact that's not it's not giving permission beforehand, like tickling, wrestling, or even hugging. Someone's time that they're not okay with giving up. Sometimes in sales, when a salesperson keeps pestering someone to buy something. These are all examples of ways that a lack of consent is normalized or even encouraged in our society. It happens in medical situations as well, definitely true. I'm going to share one prominent historical example that I had. So when I was putting this panel together and I was thinking about where are we seeing boundary crossings in our daily life, or a lack of consent and respect in our daily life that is encouraged or normalized, I immediately thought of this image. So this is it's a visual, historical, and a popular representation that is glamorized or historicized incorrectly. I didn't know the history of this image for years, but the woman in this image was finally interviewed in 2019 and gave us some context. So for context, for those who may not have seen this image before, this is a photograph taken in August 1945 in Times Square, New York. It portrays a Navy sailor embracing and kissing a total stranger who turns out to be a dental assistant on Victory over Japan Day in the United States. So the story behind this goes that this woman wasn't even a nurse, was a dental assistant, and was just like grabbed by this man. They didn't know each other. They hadn't even spoken to each other prior or after this image. But it became a truly iconic image. I remember growing up and seeing this in history books or talking about this in history class as like a representation of like joy, and learning the history behind it. Like, this is something that is so normalized, and like many people don't know the actual history behind it. And it's a way that like a lack of consent is kind of ingrained into our society. And it got me to think, how many times have I seen this image of like in the course of my life without realizing, one, its deeper implications, but two, its impacts on the woman in the photo, but boundary crossings. When this woman was interviewed in 2019 and asked to recreate this image, she said flat out no. So it's kind of telling now how images like this kind of seep into our society and how we should rethink boundary crossings. And as one person in the chat said earlier, it's never too late to reassert your boundaries or create boundaries with individuals. So this is just one example that I was thinking of when putting this presentation together as a historical visual example. But with that being said, and with all of the great contributions we've had in the chat, I want to turn it over to our panelists for our next set of questions. I'm going to read out the questions this time for folks in the chat. But the first question is, how are we socialized into not valuing consent and respect? The second question is, what is the impact of living in an environment where consent and respect is not valued? And the third question is, what messages do people learn about themselves and the world when their right to consent is violated in both big and seemingly small ways? So I'm going to let the panelists answer whichever question speaks the most to them. And then folks can continue to add to the chat and the Q&A section as we go along.
Yeah, question 3. When I think when individuals go through things and their boundaries are not respected, they're not listened to, and they did not consent to something, and it happens anyway to them. And we know usually when someone does something to someone without their consent, they usually know that individual, whether that's a friend, acquaintance, a family member. Strangers are very rare when it comes to sexual assault and those kind of things. So it's usually somebody we know. And what I have found is that it's easier for someone that's been sexually assaulted by a stranger to heal than someone that's been sexually assaulted by somebody they know, somebody of their inner circle, somebody that's close to them. It's really hard if it was a family member that was close to them, because the problem is that you trusted this individual, and this is the person that hurt you. So you look at the world totally different now. Who do I trust? I knew this person for 20 years, or I knew this person for a long time, that we had a good relationship, and they end up hurting me. Is my radar off? How do I know who to trust? How do I know if it's safe to let somebody in to my life, into my world, to know my innermost personal thoughts? So to me, when consent is violated, when that line is crossed, the hardest thing is being able to trust individuals. You look at your world totally different. Since I've been doing this work in sexual violence, I look at everything different. There were so many sexual assaults in parking ramps that I rarely go on a parking ramp now. And when I do, I park right by the door and the elevator and everything. So when certain things happen, it changes the way you look at your world and the way you navigate your world and who you let in. And that's not always good, because the majority of people in the world are good, right? There's just a handful of folks that are bad, and they do bad stuff over and over again. So it's hard for individuals to open that door, although if we don't, we may be not letting in people that are good for us, right? That could be positive folks in our lives. But what I find is that trust is not there, and it's very hard for individuals to trust and to be in a close relationship with somebody, or even in a relationship that's not even intimate, that's friendly. Because friends can also hurt you and do bad things to you. And and I tell them sometimes it's okay if you don't have the same view of the world, right? There's a lot of positive things that can come out of this now, right? And you just know that you can't trust everybody, and you will figure it out as you go along. You don't have to figure everything out right away, right now. So I think just having that worldview changed. Yeah, it's hard for folks.
I can try to answer question 1 a little bit more deeper. And so when I was kind of thinking about when he had raised up some of those questions about, obviously, where do we learn a lot of this socialization pieces? And right away, it made me think of like some of the TV shows and social media that I was exposed to when I was growing up and younger. And I think it's very important to acknowledge the just kind of the romanticization and glamorization and kind of the general reinforcement of either just harmful or just straight up very abusive relationships. And so I think, you know, the first thing that made me think about that was the movie Beauty and the Beast. And so that is actually briefly mentioned in the Healthy Relationships Activity book. But I think, you know, certainly the end of Beauty and the Beast is kind of a romantic fairy tale and everything. But in reality, the Beast kind of always seems on the verge of violence. He is threatening Belle to be there, or else he will hurt Belle's father. He's kind of saying that she must come to dinner, or he's going to break down the door, things like that. And then, of course, you know, as I mentioned before, it's a happily fairy tale ever after, right? And so I think there's this idea that, you know, again, kind of stereotyping this idea that women can fix men even if they are incredibly violent and harmful against them. So really kind of focusing on how that is truly glamorized, and at times that can kind of be seen as this pedestal for some people to achieve. And so I think that's one very clear example that's gendered in terms of women and female identified folks. But another show that I thought of, folks might be familiar with this TV show called Drake and Josh. And so I absolutely loved that show growing up. And there are these two brothers, and Drake is kind of seen as this cool womanizer type guy. And then Josh is kind of this smart, nerdy guy, stereotypically everything like that. But in one scene, Drake is just kind of hanging out at the movie theater, and all of a sudden, without any warning, nothing whatsoever, kind of very similar to the kiss, as E had mentioned, a girl kind of runs up and just starts basically making out with Drake. And I think it's very important to share that side, is because there's an assumption that men are always kind of on the prowl for sex, or are always wanting to be sexually active, and men don't really need consent, for example. I think that's a huge idea of this, what Khalees had mentioned before, that boys will be boys. And I think this can be very harmful in terms of male survivors, and this idea that men, for example, can't be raped, or even when a man might have some type of physiological response to a sexual assault, such as, getting an erection or something, and that is used to say then that person was giving their consent, for example. So again, hopefully not to harp on it too much, but just really thinking about how this gendered socialization is so very important. And kind of some of the subpoints under question 1 here. So why is devaluing consent normalized in our culture? I would do a lot of consent trainings with college students when I was actually a college student. And oftentimes we would always hear like, oh, well, like verbally asking consent is, such a mood killer, or just like really kills the vibe and everything. And so I think historically, we really felt that consent is much more like a contract, something that just needs to be checked off. And it's just kind of this thing that's in the way to whatever's going to happen, right? And I think we really have to get away from this idea of consent, because truly it should all just be about communication and checking in with that other person, whether it's about a sexual interaction or not. And so, and plenty of times when I was doing these trainings, people would say that I love it when someone asks consent to kiss me or, do X, Y, Z, right? And so really trying to, reinforce the idea that we just have to have communication, and that is really, in my mind, what consent is really grounded within. And I'll just do a really quick answer to question number 2, being, so what is the impact of living in an environment where consent and respect is not valued? And honestly, I think that is the world that we live in right now for the most part, right? And so we have to be aware of, for example, I think on social media, with Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, everyone thought it was so funny that Kanye had bought a house right next to Kim Kardashian, when in reality that was really rooted within an ex-partner trying to monitor and potentially control their ex-partner. But that was very humorous on social media, for example. And then of course, the Me Too movement is very alive and well still, right? And there's plenty of people who have immense privilege and power and have done all these various abuses and have been called out for it, but there has been no accountability taken for it. So of course, it's very important to continue having these conversations, continue having them at a very young age, because even if we do educate all the young people on what consent is, that's going to be amazing, but that's only one small step of the process. Because if they have all these great values of consent and boundaries, but they're put out into a world that doesn't practice those same values, that's going to be a huge contrast, right? So it has to be everyone in society has to be working towards these goals.
Thank you so much for your input and answers. It's great to hear. And we had some folks in the chat also having a discussion while this was going on, asking questions. One person said, question 3 makes me think of marginalized communities are constantly studied, surveilled, etc., without that data ever coming back to them in a meaningful way. also when we do community engagement and get feedback that doesn't get used or respected, um, and talking about the statement boys will be boys, and also talking about talking about asking for consent and fear of negative reactions as well. Um, One person said, I think it's important to note that people of all genders can have physiological responses to sexual assault, not just men. That can make the good touch, bad touch message confusing for kids in cases when an inappropriate, unwanted touch can cause a sexual response, which I think is a great point to add to this. I'm going to give folks here a couple minutes if they'd like to add anything to the chat or the Q&A section before I move on to our next theme, but thank you all so much for your participation so far. All right, we are running a tiny bit behind schedule, so I'm going to go ahead and follow up with our next theme. But as questions come up, feel free to drop them in the chat and Q&A section. But I'm going to move on to our next theme here. So now that we've kind of talked about what is consent and respect, where do we learn about it, how can we begin to unpack it, I wanted to give the panelists an opportunity to talk about their experiences with promoting consent and respect organizationally. So feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go along, but I'm going to let the panelists answer these 3 questions about promoting consent and respect across their organization. So the first question is, tell us about your organization and how its goals or operations promote a culture of respect and consent. The second question is, tell us about your specific position and how your role promotes a culture of respect and consent. And the third question is, discuss a moment in time where you were able to promote a positive culture of respect and consent in the workplace. And as always, panelists, feel free to answer whichever question speaks to you, and I will turn it over to our panelists.
Okay, I'll start with one. So I work for SOS, Sexual Violence Services, part of Ramsey County Public Health Department, which can be good and bad when you're part of the government, because there's a lot of things we can't do. But one thing that I like about SOS is that all our services are free and confidential. So we can work with anybody from anywhere, and we get calls from all over. As far as filing a police report and those kind of things, it has to be in Ramsey County because we can't go out of Ramsey County. But we can work with individuals whether they file a police report or not. I always say it's not my job to tell somebody to file a police report. My job is to explain that process and offer support every step of the way. So sexual assault victims in Ramsey County, the protocol is not to have them talk to law enforcement without an advocate present. And so we have law enforcement call us before they interview any sexual assault victims, unless sometimes they interview them over the phone, which we don't like. We like that in person now since COVID's over. But really just letting law enforcement, prosecutors, forensic nurses, and everyone, we are good about giving that power and control back to survivors. Because we know that sexual assault is about taking someone's power and control. And so we have a lot of ways to give that back. We, as SOS, our main goal is to support and provide education and information, right? Because we know that education and information is powerful so that individuals can make these decisions for themselves. So no one is forced to do anything. And we work from a victim-centered spot, which means we meet survivors where they're at. And we build on their strengths. And I don't know what's best for me, so I can't tell somebody else what's best for them, only they can. But they also have to have all that information and options. We also provide options. A lot of times when someone gets sexually assaulted, they don't want to make a police report, but they want that individual to know that they did something. So they're like, can I make a police report and have law enforcement go and talk to them and question them? Yes, you can. Of course you can. If they don't want to go any further, then they're fine with that. Sometimes the perpetrator has committed so many sexual assaults and has such a long rap record that the police can't let it go. They have to follow through with or without the victim's cooperation. But with SOS, we do nothing without the cooperation of the survivor. And that goes into question 2 about my specific position, because I am a sexual violence advocate. I am there for the survivor. It's not about me, but it's about helping this person get through a very traumatic event that a lot of individuals don't understand. They think you look okay. Why are you laying in bed? Why can't you get up? You seem okay. People have an easier time with intimate partner violence. They can understand a black eye or a big lip, but sexual violence is different because if there are injuries, it's where the clothes are, and so it's hidden, right? But it's all emotional. It's a lot of emotion and psychological, and of course some physical. But just recognizing that that individuals may not be okay in a week or 2, and that's fine. But just giving them options and referrals, and letting them know that, nope, you're not going crazy and you're not alone, and that this program is here for you, and we are here to support you.
Well, I'm really glad that Khalees was able to touch on the idea of being a direct service provider and working with folks who have these experiences, because I was really wanting to talk about internally within our own organization at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, because obviously that is very important too, and knowing that a lot of folks are direct service providers on this call as well. But MNCASA has done quite a lot of work, and of course that work isn't done, but we are still working towards doing some organizational trauma work. And so that means whether the trauma that we might have experienced at our time at MNCASA, perhaps kind of the previous trauma that we have experienced individually, or just at a different workplace and have brought into this space at MNCASA. So working on some organizational trauma work, but then also working on racial equity work at our organization as well. And so, for example, in terms of racial equity, really being aware of some of the, what we call the pillars of white supremacy that I believe the educator was Tima Ukun, who had developed that idea. But some of those pillars of white supremacy can be perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, kind of this quantity over quality, and worship of the written word. And so really trying to be aware of how some of these harmful ideas, not only for ourselves, but then also the community members that we might work with. And if and when these get reproduced, that can be very harmful for ourselves doing this type of work, but then also for folks who are our community partners. And so in an attempt to try to eliminate some of this work that's been, or some of these harmful things that may have been going on, we really have tried to create some organizational values and agreements, how we can kind of come together as a staff to prevent this, really trying to be proactive rather than reactive to any harm that might happen. And also, I think it's very important to celebrate little wins together organizationally. So really ensuring that we're trying to, and I think we'll talk about it in the next theme more in depth, but really being aware of self-care as an organization, especially as we are not even ourselves, but just kind of in this field, being a direct service type of field where there is a ton of vicarious trauma. Self-care is so important. So that's kind of talking about question number 1, but I did want to briefly touch on question number 3. And this is actually an example in which I had unintentionally done some potential harm, and I was actually kind of brought in rather than called out. And so typically, whenever we have just an all-staff meeting at MNCASA, we just kind of share a little question or a check-in icebreaker. And I can't remember what it was, but I was talking about my dog. His name's Wally, and he's about 10 months old. And so I was sharing that, you know, he gets super, super excited when he's around other dogs. And quite honestly, we're working with consent with him because he gets way up in other dogs' faces and he does not take the cue to like, okay, let's chill. They want to have their own space. So we're working on that. But I had used the term to describe Wally's behavior, that he was behaving like a spaz. And so I was unconsciously using ableist language. And I knew that it's obviously not okay, but I think obviously still having some internal ableist ideas and still doing some work. And so one of my coworkers had just sent me a direct message. So nothing like publicly shaming or anything like that, but just giving me a gentle reminder that, hey, please don't use the term spaz because that has historically been used to harm folks within their disabled populations or community. And then saying, instead of utilizing that word, maybe you can use, silly or goofy or just high energy, right? And so my coworker doing that gentle, again, not a call out, but a call in and bringing me in to that space in a helpful, more positive way. And then even giving me some very important or direct terms to use otherwise. So I think that's very important to be aware of, kind of me trying to be honest and accountable to some of the harm that I may have caused and really trying to, improve that for everyone in my space and the services that I'm trying to provide. So I think that piece is really important, what I wanted to share with you all as well.
Yeah, I just had one little comment on 3. To me, the workplace is the hardest. There's so many different personalities, and at public health, there were like 20 people all in one spot. And there were a lot of things said that were so inappropriate. And I'm just going to say some stuff was racist. And to tell you the truth, as an African-American woman, almost 59 years old, I should have said something. I just didn't feel like dealing with it. Sometimes it's just, I'm like, these are grown adults. Why is this stuff coming out of their mouth? At one point, I did have a conversation with somebody and they go, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way. And I said, it doesn't matter. I said, it didn't come out good at all. And if it's impacting me, it could be impacting others. So to me, dealing with coworkers and in the workforce, in the workplace, my thing is, we have enough going on with sexual assault victims, right? We hear such bad, hard stories to take in. And like Hunter said, everybody has to practice self-care, especially when you do that direct services, and to also have some stuff happening in the office that's not appropriate, to me is just ridiculous. And I have said that our focus needs to be on the survivors, and it's not about us. So to me, that is the hardest place to kind of exert my boundaries, I guess. It's easier for me around family, around friends, no problem. But in the workplace, sometimes I think because of the work we do, I'm just exhausted, and that's just one more thing that would be on my list. And so I have let a lot of stuff go that was totally inappropriate, but it was picked up by other individuals. And so things are slowly changing. But I just wanted to throw that in. Hunter, thank you for your comment. It's just not always easy to address those kind of issues in the workplace, for sure.
Thank you both for the answers, and we have some questions in the chat as well. I'm going to wait till the end of the presentation to answer for this question to be presented, just because I really want to make sure we get to part 4 of this presentation. But thank you everyone for continuing to ask questions in the chat and adding on to everyone's conversation, making it really collaborative. I really appreciate it as we continue. So now that we've got to hear from our panelists directly how their work and their role kind of promotes consent and respect organizationally, I wanted to take a moment and think about how we as individuals, especially for folks who may not be working directly with survivors or in anti-violence programs, can still engage their community to shift to a culture of respect and consent. So I wanted to start with kind of like an ideation activity on Menti again. So we'll be using the same website as we did at the beginning of the presentation, a different QR code this time and a different link this time. But this is the final word cloud. It may ask you to answer the first question again, but you can skip to the second question, which is on the screen here. I just posted the link to the word cloud in the chat. But on the screen here, it says, word cloud, what does shifting to a culture of respect and consent mean to you? And what does shifting to a culture of respect and consent look or feel like to you? You could use emotions that you would feel or phrases that you would hear people say. And then for those who want to really ideate and think about how to take all this information with them, you can brainstorm what is one way you want to practice doing that in the future. So like I said, you can either click on the link in the chat or scan the QR code and go to the second question and type whatever phrases you'd like in the word cloud. And I'm going to share my screen and show that word cloud now. Okay, it looks like some folks are saying that the word cloud is leading them to the same link as the last one. If you're having trouble with Menti, feel free to also drop it in the chat and I can read responses in the chat as we get them. But I'm sharing the screen now if folks want to share on Menti. I have a couple of things in the chat. One person says the Menti link is working for them. If you're having trouble accessing it, you can also, on the top of the screen, it says go to www.menti.com and use the code 48580105. And that may lead you directly to this screen. So I'm going to full screen that now and read off a couple. One person said changes in policy. One person said empathy, listen, and patience. Another one related to policy, one person said equal protection under the law. One person said freeing, happy to be there, trust, all great words associated with emotions and how we feel in that situation. It means hope for an abuse-free world. One thing that I was thinking of is like hope, like joy, normalizing and setting and respecting boundaries, changing old traditions, respect. One person in the chat said being able to be more vocal about abuse, setting an example to others by asking if I can share or do something before I do, being that person who kind of models respecting consent and respecting boundaries, let other people follow in your footsteps. One person said, realizing how a culture of respect can really have a positive ripple effect, having hard conversations with peers, family, or youth, empowering others to live, value consent for themselves and others, naming when I feel disrespected and offering an alternative action that would be more rooted in consent and respect. One thing in the chat kind of related to Hunter's comment about calling in that I thought was really insightful is one person said there are a lot of well-meaning people who are completely oblivious to how their perspectives or words are damaging in certain communities. I think it's important to approach those people with grace and inform them of a more helpful way of interacting with others. And I think that message in the chat connects with what a lot of people are saying here, modeling how to respect other people's boundaries, validating when people feel like a boundary has been crossed, always asking others for permission, valuing direct communication. One person said, I want to practice this by being an example of the change I want to see, as well as encouraging others to do the same. So I'm going to give folks a couple more minutes here to either drop in the chat or use Menti to share some responses to these questions. one person in the mentee word cloud said taking responsibility when we are told we didn't act in a respectful way and committing ourselves to doing better in the future. Accountability is a huge part of promoting this culture of respect and consent and promising and working on doing better. So thank you all so much for your contributions and building upon what other people are saying and really making this collaborative. I'm going to continue to our questions for our panelists, but like I said, feel free to continue to ask questions in the chat. And if we have time at the end, I will present them to our panelists. So let me reshare my screen here because right now I am on Menti. Let's see here. I want to be here. So thank you again, everyone, for your contributions. And I'm going to turn over to our panelists. So the 3 questions here for our panelists are, for individuals who do not have a specific role for victim survivors, how can they promote a culture of respect and consent? The second question is, what do you think are the positive impacts on our environments if they promote a culture of respect and consent? And the third question is, fighting against social norms can feel exhausting and defeating at times. How can we extend compassion to ourselves when we're facing someone who wants to maintain the status quo? So panelists, feel free to answer any or all of these questions.
Okay, I'll just start with one. I think as far as promoting a culture of respect and consent from parents to children starts at an early age, and it starts with having a conversation about respecting your body. And I agree that good touch, bad touch it's a little out of date. Actually, public health is working on something else for young kids now. But and then from peer to peer, I remember I was somewhere with my nephew, who was, of course, he was in his 20s at the time, and we were having a discussion, and he said, you know, I don't really consider myself a person that would disrespect somebody. He said, but I don't see anything when I hear my friends joking about the way somebody looks or their weight, and he said it's usually a female that they're talking about. He said, I don't join in, but I don't see anything either. I said, well, if you don't speak up, then you're saying it's okay and you're agreeing. And so just having those little conversations like that with your peers, with your children, just bringing stuff to their attention. There are so many small things that we all can do to promote consent that we don't even realize would make a huge difference. At the workplace, I know when I was in the office before COVID, my cube was small, and I really didn't like people coming from behind me because I couldn't see them and standing over my shoulder in my cube. And I made that very clear at a staff meeting, and there's a couple of people that kept doing it. And I said, you're really not respecting my boundaries. I said, that bothers me when all of a sudden I turn around and you're behind me when you could just come in front of me. So I think just having those conversations and just keeping it very simple, very plain, not going into a lot, just to really get into the point about what is important, and everybody deserves to be respected, and especially in the community as a whole. I think I think there's just so much going on, and it's a lot of cultural stuff too, because we know a lot of different cultures have a lot of different beliefs as far as how they raise their kids, and a lot of different things. And so just trying to respect everybody and how everybody likes to do things and how everybody is different, but also making sure we have consent as well as a community. But like I said, having those conversations and having those clear conversations, not beating around the bush. I think back in my day, I think my mom was talking about something, and I have no idea to this day what she was saying, because she kept going around. She couldn't come right out and say it because they didn't do that back in the 70s, right? But just being very clear with whoever you're talking to, whether that's a peer, whether that's a child, or whether that's a co-worker. just explaining why these things are important and why it's important to respect your coworkers. Or if somebody brings something to your attention, don't take it as a negative, take it as a learning experience. And oh, you know what, I shouldn't have said that. I'm not going to say that next time. I'm going to think a little more before stuff comes out of my mouth. Those kind of things I think are important. And I think we can all do that. I think we all say and do things. And our intent is not to hurt or harm, but I think sometimes it does. And it causes a lot of issues for individuals. So just being more aware of our environment, of our actions, our behavior, and also verbally, how we're speaking to someone or how we're speaking about someone also, I think is huge. So, and I think that goes for like everything, the workplace, when parents talk to their kids, and especially peers. That peer-to-peer is huge. I think peers have a lot of influence on other peers, and it can be negative, but it can also be positive. And I think that's that is what we need to build on, for sure.
And so briefly, I can follow up on question number 1 as well, but I actually just wanted to throw into the chat, at MNCASA, we have what is called the Rosemary Project, and that is one of our primary prevention flagship initiatives. And that really talks about just the fact that, you know, trying to actually do something against sexual violence can sound super overwhelming, right? And we kind of reference that to like starting a garden. That can seem very overwhelming because maybe you don't know you know, how much supplies or how much seed you have to buy. You don't know how much water you might need. You might not have all the tools, all those things. And so our Rosemary Project has a bunch of very tangible ideas in what ourselves as individuals can do so we can increase our knowledge, but then also looking at certain populations. So that can be parents, what you can do to prevent violence, or what men and masculine identified folks can do to prevent violence. So just some examples there, but I did just want to briefly touch on question 3 and going back to this idea of self-care. So we know that a lot of the folks in this space are direct service providers, and self-care is very important. However, I think it's very important to be aware of the fact, and this is not my phrase or my line, I actually heard it from one of our member programs. So just want to give credit where credit is due, but they had said, you know, you can't bubble bath or you can't walk your dog out of trauma or the stress that you are experiencing, whether that is through the trauma that you've experienced personally or just the vicarious trauma that you might be experiencing at work, right? And so I think we really have to institutionalize self-care. And so I think, you know, just some ideas of that from our member programs at MNCASA has really been, you know, if someone is off for a week and they come back to the office on Monday, like that Monday is typically pretty stressful and busy. So, you know, you can create a policy at your organization to not create any additional meetings for that person that day. Or maybe you're going to have like a monthly stipend of $50 where someone can go and, you know, get a massage, or they can get food for a recipe that's very nostalgic and heartwarming for them. So really just trying to acknowledge the humanity that each and every single one of us brings ourselves into this work, and then knowing that we have to work with people who've experienced a very complex trauma at times. But I'll stop there because I know that we only have about 5 minutes left.
And I just want to pop in on question 2. I mean, the positive impacts on our environment and culture would be awesome. I mean, I can't imagine a world where everybody is respected, where their boundaries are respected, where consent is that everybody knows what that means. And so there is no fear and there is no, you know, it would be a much better world, of course, if those things, you know, if that happened, and there's no reason why it can't. And I think it would also impact how we form relationships and and just how we look at the community. I think all that would change, and it would all change for the better, because we know that that we have that consent and that we can set boundaries and that nobody's going to cross those boundaries and that individuals are going to respect me for who I am and what I believe in. And I think that would just be an awesome world. I hope I'm still around one day to see it if it happens.
Yeah, thank you to our panelists for answering these questions and all the questions that we've had previously. I really wanted to make sure we ended thinking about how we can take this information forward. So I'm really quickly, we have a couple minutes left, going to provide some contact info for our panelists. This will also be available in the follow-up email that you will receive in the next couple days from us. But Khalees Smith at Ramsey County SOS Sexual Violence Services, you can see their email and phone number there. Hunter Beckstrom from Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, MN CASA. They have a Facebook, a Twitter, and as you know, they have plenty of resources, which I'm going to get into in the next slide as well. And Khalees and Hunter, feel free to drop any resources or your email in the chat as well. With that being said, I'm really briefly going to go over some resources we have to continue the conversation. Hunter's mentioned a couple of these, the Rosemary Project and Healthy Relationship Activity Book. But there's also things like the Man Enough podcast, which talks about unpacking masculinity, the Sexual Citizens, Power, Sex, and Assault on Campus book, White Supremacy Culture, which is a great article, the Sexual Violence Continuum and the Socio-Ecological Model. So I'm going to really quickly drop the links in the chat. If you do not have time to click on them, they will also be provided in the post-webinar email. But I'm going to paste those really quickly. Khalees has also dropped her email in the chat if anyone would like to follow up with Khalees. These are some links to some things that have already been mentioned and some new resources. And I'm going to go ahead. We only have 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to wrap up the presentation there. But if you have any final questions, feel free to drop them in the survey that will be sent out. So when you leave the Zoom call, you will get linked to a survey. It'll also be in the post-webinar email. Any additional questions can be sent in that survey and will be forwarded to our panelists, or you can email the panelists directly given their contact information. But if you would like to download a copy of this presentation, you can scan the QR code. You can download a certificate of attendance at the link below, which is bit.ly/respect-consent-certificate. And I will also provide there will also be a link to the certificate in the post-webinar email. Due to changes in our certificate process, you no longer have to email us to receive and download a certificate of attendance. So that is where you can find our slides. And I'm just going to paste a couple of links. Can you repost the certificate link? Of course. I think that the one shared was actually not the correct one, and I apologize for that. So I'm going to pull up the correct certificate link for everyone here. And if you would like, you can wait for the post-webinar email to come out as well, and the link to download the certificate will be there. But here is a link. I will drop it in the chat. So if you click on this link in the chat, you can download a certificate of attendance. So you can stay connected with women's advocates on our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube pages. You can email us at outreach@wadvocates.org, join our monthly listserv, or check out our upcoming events. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to all the participants, the great conversations we had in the chat. I'm going to stop recording the webinar now. And thank you all for your time and contributions.
Thank you.